And we're back with another American Promise in-depth conversation. We are really excited today to have with us Maureen Kline. She's the Vice President of Public Affairs and Sustainability for Pirelli North America, responsible for the US, Canada, and Mexico. She's based in New York and also in Georgia, where they have a significant manufacturing facility. And she sits on the board of the US Tires Manufacturers Association, Tire and Rubber Association of Canada as well. She's also a journalist and continues writing a column on sustainability for Inc.com and is a frequent speaker on the topic of sustainable business. And she has also been based in Pirelli's headquarters in Milan, in Italy, and has worked and coordinated government affairs for the company's subsidiaries for many years. In her journalism career, she was based in Milan as a correspondent for the Wall Street Journal and other news sources and media outlets. And we are just delighted to have you here with us today. Maureen, welcome to American Promise in Depth.
Thank you so much.
And I want to dive right in. I'm going to ask you about your journey, which is fascinating, I think, from journalism into business and into some of the top leadership of a global business. But before I do, as we've said, we were just delighted to have you sign on to the American Promise National Business Network, a growing network of business people concerned about how money is being deployed in the American political system. It's a global problem as well, on anti-corruption efforts around the globe. But here at American Promise, certainly one we focus on, and increasingly business people like yourself are joining in our national network. And one of the things we've seen, they're ahead of us and ahead of a lot of people. And Pirelli has a global ban on political campaign contributions. That is sometimes counterintuitive. People sometimes assume, oh, corporations, they're spending money in elections. And yet your people at Pirelli are actually not allowed to under Pirelli policy, as I understand it. Do I have that right? And can you say a little bit more about why you do that, what's behind that, how that works for you, both as people in the business, but also as the business?
Yeah, so I think many European companies do this. We have a global ban on political campaign contributions that's really embedded in our ethics and compliance program, which is part of, it's sort of the governance, under the governance part of ESG, which is, our wider sustainability program. So we have in our values and ethical code, we have values like fairness and transparency, and included in that ethical code is a sort of a segment that talks about different stakeholders, because we do firmly believe in stakeholder capitalism and creating value for all stakeholders. And when we talk about the community as a stakeholder, we include that a phrase about Pirelli intends to contribute to the prosperity and growth of the communities it operates in, and so on. And it does talk about not providing contributions, advantages, or other benefits to political parties or trade union organizations or their representatives or candidates, and so on. So it's part of the compliance program, and it is in sync with the values of the company. And I think a lot of what we do in terms, we also have a corporate lobbying policy that talks about the way we see a more, I would say, a productive way of doing lobbying, and it sort of defines the relationship between the company and its governmental stakeholders, and it describes a positive engagement where, on the one hand, we are looking at alignment with our values and with the company's values, the company's interests, but also our place in society. And so how do we think of the community as a stakeholder, and how can we create value for that stakeholder by making positive contributions?
Yeah, and some other big companies have a similar policy. IBM, for one, has never permitted political contributions. And you touched on something I'd like to just drill in on a little bit, if you don't mind. I think sometimes people hear lobbying and they assume that means sort of pay to play, raise a lot of money, threaten with super PACs coming in with a tax if you don't go our way. And that's certainly how it's being practiced increasingly in this country. But it doesn't have to be that way. And when you have a policy that doesn't allow political spending, you still are bringing information to bear in public policy that's both helpful and needed, both not only for the business, of course, but for public policy. And can you share a little bit more about that? Does it affect your ability to lobby if you're not going to the fundraisers and everything else? And how do you think about those competitors of yours who might be at those fundraisers, raising money, spending money for politicians? Unpack the lobbying connection a little bit more, and what sort of good lobbying is, if you can put it that way, what lobbying for with stakeholder capitalism looks like versus sort of a pay to play kind of impression or misimpression that some may have about lobbying.
Yeah, so I actually do not lobby. I spend less than 20% of my time on public affairs in general. I actually have four areas that I supervise in the company. But I do think that I do think that policymakers are interested in being fully educated when they're working on their policy making. And so just to give a random example, we might have, there might be policymakers that are interested in passing new regulations for more environmentally friendly tires. And we might agree with that. And we might, when I say we, I mean the industry, so maybe through the trade associations. We might agree with that, but we might also point out to them that that particular direction would lead to an unsafe tire being on the market, or a tire that's actually illegal because there are safety regulations already that preclude the other thing. So getting into the weeds about concrete information, I think, is useful. And then I would also say that I'm lucky because I'm not familiar with an area where the tire industry needs to somehow advocate in its self-interest in a way that's detrimental to society, because usually what we're talking about is safer tires or that sort of thing. If it were detrimental to society, I think I would question whether that's a good business to be in at all, right?
And that speaks to your stakeholder capitalism and ESG points. And for those new to this conversation, ESG is environment, sustainability, and governance.
Environmental, social, and governance. The social part is normally about human rights and employee well-being. So the human part, it could also refer to inequality, and then the governance part is largely about ethics and compliance. And so we really do focus on global anti-corruption rules, and that includes a no gifts policy, and the corporate lobbying policy that has lots of limits on what we would consider ethical behavior. Yeah.
Can I ask, I think you bring a really interesting perspective, being a global company, being based for the global company in Italy, but obviously very engaged in Pirelli North America, right here in the United States. What are the differences you see in sort of the political spending and the campaign spending and the way it intersects with business in Europe versus America?
Well, I'm not familiar with every country in the world, but I doubt if there's any country that spends more on political advertising and that sort of, the part where the dark money is going. I don't know that really happens certainly in Europe. I do think that there is somewhat, that like every country grapples with the issue of how to deal with the idea that power corrupts, right? And so do we heavily regulate? Do we require a lot of transparency? How do we fund political campaigns at all. I'm sure that this is what you talk about among yourselves day in, day out. And some countries have, one term only, like the Mexican president serves for 6 years and then they're gone and they can't run again, with the idea that that would help avoid corruption. And in Italy, there had been government money, so public funds going to political campaigns to avoid a situation like we have in the US where corporate funding is so key. But they've actually come away from that and have rules that are a little bit more like the US now. And this reminds me of something, which is, I helped, when I was in Italy, I helped write a book on meritocracy. I helped do the research behind this book on meritocracy. And we noticed that there was a timeline in terms of a meritocratic society, right? So the word meritocracy originally came up in the UK when they were trying to break up the aristocracy and allow talented and hardworking people to rise through the system. And so in Italy, we had a situation where people couldn't rise through the system, including political candidates, unless they knew the right people or they were from the right family. So, how do you go about introducing meritocracy? Well, it turns out that once you introduce meritocracy and you have, the most talented people rise to the top and rise to the top of the business establishment, well, then those people start taking over the system, which is really where we are in America. So we've got these very talented people in these very large corporations who have lobbied heavily for laws in their favor, leaving behind whole swaths of society, right? So I feel like it's all interconnected. The inequality, the corporate political spending, the laws that we have, the system that we have. And so I feel like Europe is, the reason I brought that up is I feel like Europe is on a similar timeline to the US, but not as kind of late stage. And clearly, you've brought up such an important point that in order to have a more equitable society, we need to really address this problem of corporate money in politics because of, having kind of taken over the system for corporations in a way that's not necessarily in the greater societal interest.
Yeah, and if I could follow up on that, because what we also see is massive spending by billionaires or mere multi-hundreds of millionaires, as well as there are some remaining big powerful unions that spend heavily as well. And I think what you pointed out in your book, and as you described your book just now, about those cycles of meritocracy leading to enrichment, and then leading to a new aristocratic class, if you're not careful as a society, is a recurring problem in human history. I think that the constitutional founders and framers and Americans, and I'm sure Europeans and other democracies, have been aware of that, and you have to have those checks and balances, or it's as natural as the sun coming up. And that's why I think you have a classic experience both in Italy and I'm sure at Yale. I have asked all around the country as I've gone out, does anybody know a democracy that's lasted 3 centuries? Because I'm getting a little nervous, and we're headed into our 3rd century. And I think the common thread is they tend towards oligarchy, plutocracy, aristocracy, and then economic power leveraged into political power. Can you help us? Are we really at the edge of the human experience, or is that what you're talking about, that concern?
I do think there's a way forward to bring back some of those checks and balances, and that's to move from shareholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism, because as I mentioned before, when the stakeholder is the community and society and the environment, for example, which is one of Pirelli considers the environment one of our stakeholders. And so if you move towards that being the model, and I think that does need a push from government, that could lead us sort of back to more checks and balances.
Indeed. there's a quote out there. I want to share it with you and see what you think of this. I don't think it came from you or anyone at Pirelli. A company that is dependent on the government that does not donate to politicians is engaging in corporate malpractice. That's the end of the quote.
I'm curious who said that,
I-
but certainly what it reminds me of is this idea that that the corporation needs to maximize profits for its shareholder, so at any cost, right? And so if I'm focused on maximizing profits for my shareholder, I want the government to do what is in the best self-interest of my company. And that's the shareholder model, but it might be at the expense of society. And so again, we need to pivot to stakeholder capitalism, which again, I think requires some regulation in a number of areas. I mean, you can start with ESG disclosure to investors, and that would already help.
Yeah. And so is it fair to say, well, let me put it this way. So our American Promise Business Network, which we are very glad to have you in, thank you for that, is really focused on the consensus that we actually think most business people feel, that we ought to have reasonable limits on the money in politics. So one person, one vote. If society decides, unions and corporations should focus on the economy, not on political competition. It's okay to have limits or even prohibitions on corporate and union political spending, as we once did in this country, and not too long ago. Is, in your experience, is that a sort of the idea that we should have limits, a wildly out of sync notion in the business world? Are you an outlier, or is that fairly consistent? How would you describe that in the business world?
Well, I think so. The Public Affairs Council in Washington does have some really good resources on the small, transparent part of corporate political giving, which is the corporate PACs, which, the ones where employees contribute. So there are limits on those, and there's actually quite a bit of transparency around that. So if that's all we had, I still, I'm not a big fan of that, because it does feel to me like a little bit like coercion of employees could happen, because employees are being asked to give to the PAC through their paycheck and so on. Of course, it's voluntary, but that level of transparency and those levels of limits, I think, are certainly very, very healthy and positive.
Yeah. And what about the super PACs and all the so-called independent spending, whether it's corporations, billionaires, unions? Now the new rules of the road are basically no rules of the road. And we're finding, I wonder if you do too, that many business people think that's not sustainable and it's not good for business, let alone for democracy.
No, I think you're right. I mean, I think there are serious reputational problems. There's now this new world of companies taking stands, brands taking stands, if you want to, the rhyme, on societal issues, whether it's bathrooms or more recently voting rights, and so on. And so I think there's a huge movement in that direction, that companies are expected to take stands on societal issues. And I think that could lead us to where we want to go, because I'm guessing that a lot of people don't like the dark money, the lack of transparency, don't think it's right, feel that there's an imbalance of power, but can't necessarily speak up. And as we get companies taking stands on issues and appealing to their employees, especially the younger generations of employees, those employees, I think, are going to push them on these other things, like, do I really want to work for a corporation that is in the newspapers giving dark money that no one really knows, how much it is, where it's going, and so on, but possibly giving money to maybe the wrong people. maybe the wrong candidates that employees disagree with. So there's a talent issue as well here, reputational issues, and maintaining talent in your organization.
Yeah, and it's interesting. We actually had a national call just last evening with next generation leadership, young people, and in some ways it was discouraging, that phenomenon you're observing about turning to corporations for policy solutions. Right? Take your stand. There's some discussion. In some ways, that's the result of a collapse of trust in government and a shift from citizen to consumer, and that this generation, since 9/11 and the 2008 crash and all the way through to the pandemic, has seen increasingly government as ineffective, non-responsive, non-representative, and increasingly corporations feeling a need to speak out and respond. And at the same time, we have business people, friends who are telling us, look, that isn't our job. We really have to fix this problem because government should be fixing these things. And we got this quote unquote right to spend unlimited money and have all this influence. We never asked for that, and we'd like to just get back to business. Thank you. So it's an interesting dichotomy between the stakeholder capitalism, which I think is a very, like you, I agree, very promising trend for society and the world, frankly, and those who actually don't want to be so-called woke corporations. They end up in the same place. They'd both be better off if we didn't have unlimited money in politics and we had effective citizens able to govern society in a healthy way. The pressure would not be on corporations to solve every problem.
I fully agree. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, what do you say to other businesses that haven't gone as far along this journey as Pirelli and your fellow public affairs colleagues in other companies that would ask you, like, why should we do this? Why should we go that direction? How would you encourage more businesses to follow your leadership?
Well, I mean, I don't think, I agree. I've heard IBM talk about this, and of course they're a very powerful company, and they say, we have never found that we needed to contribute in order to have our voice heard or to engage with policymakers. I think that's probably true, not just for the all-powerful IBM. I think that I guess what I've done is, as I mentioned, I spend some time with trade associations, and I've tried to make sure that those trade associations are very much aligned with our own policies, and sort of continuously bring that up and make those points. So I guess to other businesses, I would say, I don't think you need to be spending on political campaigns. And in fact, maybe your money would be better spent on reinvesting in your business, innovation, and so on. And at the same time, I do think we need to spread the word, because we've kind of gotten into this system without really planning to, I think. And, it's this evolution that brought us here where we are now. And I think we need people to sort of step back and say, wait a minute, how did we get here? Is this productive? And can we do something differently? And so I guess I would encourage conversations within companies, and the work that you're doing, there needs to be more education and just more questioning of the current system that we live in.
And that's one of the main reasons for the American Promise National Business Network, is to create a forum for some of those conversations. And we're seeing many more, I think, places where those conversations are starting to happen, and very fruitful and promising conversations indeed. So thank you for joining our National Business Network. I did say I wanted to ask you, we've covered a lot of ground today, but there's an important question I think that people will want to know, which is your own journey, professional journey to journalism and global business. Tell us a bit more about that.
Well, I guess I fell into some of these things along my path, but I went to Italy to study, and I ended up being lucky enough to, after a short attempt to become a lawyer and work in law firms, I landed a job as a journalism assistant at the Wall Street Journal, worked my way up in the Milan bureau. And then when I was ready to leave journalism, I joined Pirelli in the communications department, and then was lucky enough to move over into coordinating government affairs, traveling all over the world, and then came back to the US. I'm from Washington originally, so I love the idea of doing public affairs, being involved in even in a very small level, because it's just a small part of my time, but being involved in the, these questions about policy and that, what direction we can go in. But I got very excited about sustainability, and was given that as part of my job because of this stakeholder capitalism aspect. I mean, I recognized that could be the way forward, and that Pirelli had a very strong sustainability program, and it made my job, much more purposeful, which is, I think, employees want to work for, people want to work for companies with some sort of sense of purpose, that, you want your job to give you a sense of purpose. And so that has happened with me through this sustainability work. And I'm very excited about the directions that we can go.
Yeah, well, that's wonderful. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you also for signing on to the American Promise National Business Network.